Cheers and welcome to another video where I address a thing that was a really big conversation in the autistic community like 6 months ago, because I'm really good at being on top. I am good at being on top of these things behind the scenes if I have the power to do something about them, but they tend to just get lost in research limbo for some time before they make their way to the channel for some reason that I should really iron out. But this allows us to have a more thorough conversation about something after it is, you know, actively taking place, because we're a little bit more distance from it, which has its pros and cons. So anyway, hi! Today we're going to talk about the whole non-speaking autistics are actually telepaths situation, and the podcast that made this abhorrent theory popular, and the whole host of issues with that. And that will include, of course, calling out my former self, because I made a less research critical video that was sort of adjacent to this concept some years ago that I took down a while back for reasons that we're going to talk about today. It's going to be a really great time. I'm really glad to have you here. For friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown just beyond shoulder length curly hair. I'm wearing an orange t-shirt and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I think that's all the housekeeping things. We did it. Amazing. Wonderful. So the Telepathy Tapes is a podcast that early this year briefly became the most listened to show on Spotify and iTunes, and has spent a really long time in the top 5 most popular podcasts, which concerns me about the state of humanity. The idea of this podcast, created by documentary filmmaker Kai Dickens, is that non-speaking autistics are telepaths and otherwise capable of extrasensory perception, and it claims to uncover the ignored hidden capabilities of these people. There's a lot to unpack already. So the supposedly undeniable evidence they use is based on an odd extrapolation about autistic young people who use facilitated communication, a concept you might remember from my recent video on the history of so-called autism cures, which I will link above if you want to check it out. The idea of FC, also marketed as the rapid prompting method or spelling to communicate, which appeared in the United States in the 90s, is that facilitators guide spellers' hands over letters on a keyboard or letterboard so they can spell out what they want to say, sometimes moving the person's hands, bodies, or the letterboard itself in order to have them point at or type words. And when this first became a popular method, all of the autistics who had never communicated in words before were suddenly waxing poetic about how they have been locked inside themselves by their autism, and now they are freed with a miraculous ability to communicate. It is particularly notable that none of these spellers were following traditional developmental linguistic learning milestones, and often writing at a reading level incredibly atypical for their age, and that they tend to spend most of their time talking about how life-changing this method has been for them, how they wish it was available for more people, often a lot of political or religious things that further this ableist savior narrative that aims to recruit more people to facilitated communication, rather than things that we expect the average child or teenager to talk about, like Bluey and Fortnite. I don't know. Many parents also pointed out that their children were only able to communicate using the board with their specific facilitator, and they would never use the board with anybody else. And after a bunch of cases came to light of spellers apparently alleging abuse, a double-blind study was conducted to see who in reality was actually doing the typing in facilitated communication cases. I do want to pause for a second. We're going to talk about the ways that the debunking of this concept has been very ableist in a moment, but I do want to just say now, like, non-speaking people are statistically more likely to end up in abusive situations. That is just a thing that is factual, and we should be believing abuse allegations. This is just a particular case where so many came to light that people were like, how can we prove in court, like, who said what thing, which is how this whole thing unraveled. But I do want to be abundantly clear that we should be believing people about things and stuff. Anyway, the double-blind studies basically had a speller on one side of a table and a facilitator on the other side, and they both would look at images, and then the speller would type out what they saw. And over 100 trials were conducted, and not a single one found that when the speller and facilitator were looking at 2 different images, the speller typed what they saw and overrided what their facilitator saw. The creator of facilitated communication has spoken about how testing is putting undue stress on the speller, and that's why the results show that facilitated communication doesn't work, and thus you shouldn't ever test it, which is always really good when the official statement about the validity of a therapeutic method is, hey bro, just trust me. There's also been a famous case of a facilitator saying that she and her client were falling in love and that he was giving her sexual consent. There's a Netflix documentary about this case, as well as another where a mother took the life of her child, saying that he had spelled out that he wanted to die and that's why she did it, maintaining that it's a mercy killing. I will also note that prompting from a facilitator is often unconscious or something that they're not really aware of. This has been described as the ideomotor effect, where a person makes small motions based on what they're thinking that they are rarely conscious of doing. This is often the phenomenon that makes Ouija boards work as well. And a common response from people in the facilitated communication community to criticism about its validity is that the person doing the criticism is actually ableist and doesn't believe that non-speaking autistics are capable of communication or intelligence. And that is how some people go about criticizing this, to be very, very clear. But also that is in my general experience, the minority of criticisms, but that might just be the community that I find myself in. I know I'm in a little bit of an echo chamber, but most people that at least I'm around point out that there are many evidence-based, independent, alternative communication methods that non-speaking people are very capable of using that do not completely hijack the individual thoughts of the disabled person using said method, where we know the person is the person communicating. ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, has lots of formal information about what kinds of AAC methods are effective and worth time and money, warning practitioners and parents against facilitated communication and any of its off-brand counterparts because of the harm that it is known to cause. Communication without autonomy is not communication and thus is robbing an individual of their right to independence. Because of the unconscious prompting from a facilitator, which is well documented as being a phenomenon, it can often seem like a speller knows things that they wouldn't have any other reason or ability to know, and so Dickens winds up believing that the mechanism for how FC works is telepathy, and that in reality non-speaking people might choose not to speak because telepathy is so much easier and more accurate and more spiritual. Obviously, the only conclusion to be made here is that non-speaking people have psychic powers. That is simply the only option that is at hand. The podcast begins by testing this hypothesis with one speller and her mother, seemingly organized by Dickens, who has no formal research background, and she also includes psychiatrist Diane Powell, who has an interesting history, including having published a book on ESP and having spoken about autism at a DC anti-vax rally, so that's great. And these tests were filmed and edited and are located behind a paywall, but researchers who have paid to look at this footage have noted how selectively edited it is, as well as how poorly the study itself is set up, making it rife for confirmation bias, and of course, it's one test case. That's not even really a study, that's just a case study. This study, however, is then used as their proof for all of the claims made in the rest of the episodes about telepathy. On the, I guess, slightly bright side, a large number of listeners have noted that they only listened to the first couple episodes and lost interest when the podcast became progressively more out there as you get to later episodes, but that's still not fantastic that they at least were listening to that portion of it. As Telepathy Tapes goes on, Dickens just spirals up and out from this initial mistake of believing that FC proves independent communication, and so that means telepathy. Not only that, non-speakers are going into their rooms alone, and while they may appear to be simply stimming for several hours, they are actually meeting in a trans-dimensional space called the Hill, where they are working out complex problems together for the benefit of humanity. This has also created a bit of a rift within the facilitated communication community, because some people are happy about the increased exposure, while others are worried that this inherent association with spirituality delegitimizes them, even though the research is already Anyway, many people have really connected with this podcast, which of course brings in the question of why is this something that people want to believe? Why is this something that people are connecting to, right? And we talked about this a bit in my Cures video, but there's a really huge disconnect between how the medical and scientific world talks about autism and how parents of autistic people experience autism, as well as not nearly enough resources and supports available for the parents and caregivers of autistic people, and that leaves a lot of little gaps of confusion and desperation that are easily filled by wishful thinking and pseudoscience. Fake autism cures are a massive industry for a reason. There is a desire for those things, and people will pay a lot of money to try to fix their child, and so those things will continue to be sought after, and people will continue to try to sell them because you can make a lot of money off of it. The Telepathy Tapes in particular suggests that the scientific community sees non-speaking people as worthless and unlikely to succeed. Meanwhile, she's offering up this alternative interpretation that does see and nurture their special value. And I don't think that that's particularly fair to say that the entire scientific community sees things like that, because there's been a lot of work done in medical communities of late to try and change language around autism and disability and all of those things. That's one of my day jobs, actually. But I also don't deny that these people have probably heard a lot of ableist and dehumanizing things said about their children that make them feel terrible. Like, I have also experienced that. Of course, on top of what society already has to say about disabled people. So it makes sense they're going to be drawn towards something that does claim to see that worth in their kid, even if it doesn't fully check out at all whatsoever. And the show also relies on highly emotional just so stories and anecdotal evidence. So sure, maybe the data doesn't quite say that this works, but it worked for this child and it changed their lives, and we can't ignore that because I want to feel like that. You know, like, it's very easy to get caught up in that emotionality. The Conspirituality podcast that I quoted a couple times in this video also talked about how this isn't very dissimilar from the traditional satanic panic, where like therapists and parents were worried and looking for certain information and then ended up sort of ventriloquizing ventriloquizing it out of those children. They also pointed out how much pseudoscience and ableist harm aside, these narratives rely on the sharing and exploitation of personal details of children's lives that do not need to be made public and actively violate the privacy of that kid, which I also think is important to note. And then when you add the ableism into it, it becomes a sort of freak show-esque thing that I have a lot of problems with. But the view of autistics offered by the Telepathy Tapes podcast also elevates their caregivers from the thankless job of being a caregiver into being a sort of spiritual guide. It suggests that they're serving a higher power. They have a uniquely special connection with their child that is under-recognized and underappreciated. And for many parents of higher support needs autistic kids, they feel a sort of disconnect from their child because we socialize differently, and this can sort of alleviate that feeling a little bit. Like, no, I get him and I'm connected to him and you know, all of that kind of stuff. And it also offers a sort of explanation for this difference. They're like this because they are gifted and they are unique, which in a world where we still kind of blame parents for the disabilities of their children, that helps people to find meaning and answers that they wouldn't otherwise have. This is also a huge reason that the autism is caused by vaccines thing caught on, because it was something to be mad at. It was something to give some closure, something to rally around, and to provide community with other parents struggling like them, because again, we do not have enough resources for parents, much less for parents of disabled children in this country. So this offers a sense of belonging and community that is not otherwise offered, which unfortunately in this particular case very easily promotes going down pseudoscientific conspiracy theory rabbit holes, which is not fantastic. It seeks to comfort the abled by suggesting that the disabled really are just like them, deep down, and that those who lack certain abilities can still justify their lives by possessing supernatural ones. And this otherworldly disabled idea also isn't anything new. Most cultures have had changeling tales for centuries where disabled children are actually the children of spirits or are otherwise otherworldly creatures that have replaced the human child. And that idea has been reincarnated in many different ways. The first one off the top of my head is in the 1970s New Age concepts of crystal children and indigo children. It also appears in the, oh, my real child is locked inside this one by the autism and we need to break them free story that's very common today and was peddled by Autism Speaks for quite some time, and is also part of the reason that FC caught on, because that easily explains how they can suddenly start communicating in poetic prose all of a sudden. And that has now appeared in this particular situation where they're saying these autistic children are lovable and important because they're magical angels who have supernatural abilities. This is where I'm gonna call myself out for a moment, because a few years back, a lot of years back, I made a video about how some people theorize that autistics can predict the future, where the conclusion I kind of came to is statistically, it's probably these other things kind of looking like the magical thing, but at the end of the day, I'm always open to the possibility, and I think it's interesting, so what do you think? And, in hindsight, I think that was a bit irresponsible of me, which is one of the reasons that I took it down a while ago. But when I made that video, I was caught in this I'm not wrong, I'm special, Aspie supremacy mindset that came out in a lot of my earlier content, where I felt like it wasn't ableism because it was focusing on our strengths. But in reality, it was just saying, oh, people like me are valuable because we can do X, Y, and Z things better than the not disabled, which is ableism. It's just packaged in toxic positivity that inevitably puts down other members of the community and also inevitably has a lot of eugenicist subtext. I've made a couple, I did eugenics videos at this point in and analyzing my old content, because disabled people are valuable because we are people and we do not need to have some sort of special ability to make up for what we can't do to make us worthy of being treated as human people. We're just human people. The one thing I will bring from that video into this one is that I did briefly mention that due to pattern recognition and sensory sensitivity, sometimes it can seem like autistics are able to tell the future because we can hear something sooner, or we have memorized how a specific sequence of events typically goes. I've also heard a lot of anecdotes of autistics thinking they're hearing ghosts or spirits because nobody else can hear what they're hearing, when it turns out it was just a light bulb that's humming and their hearing sensitivity picked up on it when nobody else's did, or people who have a strong sensory reaction to something that wasn't there because to them it feels like it's due to synesthesia or something else like that. For me, with my chronic migraines growing up, I used to be able to tell when it was gonna rain within about 10 minutes, and I was correct every single time, and I would tell people that and they were like, you can tell the weather, and it was a whole thing, but it was just because the pain in my head would feel slightly different. That's not me predicting the future, that's me just having a body that recognizes things. But these are all things that the telepathy tapes might use as proof that have completely, perfectly reasonable everyday causes, and are things that are not standard across all autistics. They're just things that might pop up more frequently for us than others for various reasons, but also not necessarily. Sensitivity to various things is in a lot of different things in the disabled community. And also humans in general can often believe that we're pretty good at predicting the future because confirmation bias is a hell of a drug, but that's sort of a given. And this also gets a little bit tricky in that I want to honor spiritualism and various beliefs that are different that people have in things, and not to be like, everything needs to be completely boiled down to science and logic. Like, I'm a very evidence-based person myself. It's going to take a lot of unequivocal proof for me to believe something, but I also acknowledge that there are always more things to learn and explore, and it would be complete hubris to assume that we know everything. I have my little spiritual good luck things. We all have our what. One of them is tattooed on my body, so you know what? It's fine. We all have our things. And I don't think that there's enough conversations about the clash between some issues of medicine and science versus like religion and culture. A really commonly discussed one is like schizophrenia versus hearing the voice of God, for example, but there are others as well. And that's a whole can of worms I'm not going to get into today, nor do I really have the qualifications to get into, though I am going to do a witchcraft video in October where we'll talk about it a little bit more. But I don't want you to leave this video being like, oh, Sydney doesn't believe in the supernatural stuff, and so that's why they're denying the validity of telepathy tapes. I'm inherently skeptical of those things because I'm me, absolutely, but I'm not inherently against them. I'm denying the validity of telepathy tapes because the podcast is actively throwing real science we know a great deal about out the window in a way that is causing great harm to a marginalized group. So like, you're welcome to believe whatever spiritual, supernatural things you want to, that's fine. And the majority of the population does believe in some semblance of the supernatural. The issue here is the pseudoscientific harm that is taking place in the name of spiritualism, that we know that's what's going on, and I want to make sure that I'm very clearly differentiating between those two things. The ableism of these disabled people are actually valuable because they possess otherworldly skills is an ableist dehumanizing problem, as is the promotion of facilitated communication, which we know denies the autonomy of a very marginalized group, made even more frustrating when we have other evidence-based alternatives available that are being just conveniently ignored by this podcast that is supposedly trying to advocate for these people and is clearly doing absolutely nothing of the sort. And then becoming one of the most listened to podcasts for quite some time and being promoted by none other than Joe Rogan. At the end of the day, the whole narrative kind of ends up being a good old-fashioned, let's pause and ponder who's benefiting from the story that's being told and figure out who is being harmed by it media analysis moment that we love to see on this channel. And I've been wanting to get a chance to at least point out the ableist issues of indigo children and crystal children for quite some time, but there's not enough content for its own video. So finally glad to check that off the list. But I hope that you learned something from this, perhaps have some talking points to use when your mom tells you about this great new podcast she's been listening to, because they are making a season 2 and also a documentary, apparently. So hooray! Also, thank you for your patience with the shorter videos this month. I have a couple big projects that I'm working on that are coming up and have taken a lot of my time and energy, so I wanted to give myself some time to be a human person. But I also do think I should probably make some shorter things every now and then to balance work-life balance a little more for myself. They just tend to be harder topics to find. So if you have anything you want me to talk about, let me know. Also, if you want to like, comment, subscribe, join my Patreon, I'd love to have you stick around. I love having you here. And in the meantime, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.